The German economy during the W2. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into one of the most complex and crucial aspects of World War II that doesn't get talked about enough: the German economy during the World War. How did Germany finance one of the largest military campaigns in history? How did they go from economic ruin to becoming a military powerhouse in just 6 years? And why did their economy ultimately collapse? By the end of this video, you'll understand the economic machinery behind the Nazi war effort, and how economic factors played a crucial role in both Germany's early successes and ultimate defeat. Let's get into it. To understand Germany's wartime economy, we need to start in 1933 when Hitler came to power. Germany was in absolute shambles. The Great Depression had hit the country hard. Unemployment stood at around 6 million people. That's nearly 1 in 3 workers without a job. The currency had been devastated by the hyperinflation of the 1920s, and the country was still struggling under the weight of World War I reparations. The Nazi regime had made big promises: jobs, economic recovery, and restoring German pride. But how would they deliver? The answer was massive government spending, particularly on rearmament and public works projects. The regime launched programs like the construction of the Autobahn highway system, which employed hundreds of thousands of workers. But the real focus was military spending. Within just a few years, unemployment dropped from 5 million to nearly 0. On paper, this looked like an economic miracle. But there were major problems lurking beneath the surface. First, this employment wasn't always voluntary. The Nazis essentially made unemployment illegal. If you refused available work, you could be sent to a labor camp. So those impressive employment numbers came with a heavy dose of coercion. Second, the economic recovery was built on borrowed time and borrowed money. The government was spending far more than it was taking in through taxes. They used creative financing schemes, including special government bills called MEFO bills, which were essentially IOUs that delayed the day of reckoning. The Nazi economic philosophy emphasized autarky, economic self-sufficiency. Germany wanted to be independent from foreign imports, especially in strategic materials. This meant developing synthetic alternatives for oil, rubber, and other resources Germany lacked naturally. But here's the key point: this economic model was unsustainable without conquest. The bills would come due eventually, and Germany needed resources it simply didn't have within its own borders. So how did Germany actually pay for the war once it started in 1939? The answer is through a combination of taxation, creative accounting, and brutal exploitation. On the home front, the Nazi regime increased taxes and controlled prices to prevent inflation. They also heavily promoted war bonds, encouraging Germans to lend money to the government. But the real financial lifeline came from the occupied territories. As German forces conquered Poland, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and other countries, they systematically looted these economies. Occupation tributes, essentially protection money forced from conquered peoples, provided about 40% of the income that Germany raised through internal taxation. That's a staggering figure. France alone bore the brunt of this exploitation, contributing 42% of all occupation revenues. The French were forced to pay for the German occupation of their own country, funding the very troops that held them under control. Beyond direct financial tribute, Germany stripped occupied territories of raw materials, industrial equipment, food, and art. Factories were dismantled and shipped back to Germany. Agricultural production was seized, often leaving local populations on the brink of starvation. But perhaps the most horrific economic aspect of the Nazi war effort was the massive use of slave labor. By 1944, the number of forced laborers in Germany peaked at 7.1 million people. These included prisoners of war, concentration camp inmates, and civilians forcibly transported from occupied territories. They worked in factories, farms, and mines under brutal conditions. This wasn't just morally reprehensible, it was also a core component of the Nazi economic model. Without this forced labor, German war production would have collapsed much earlier. The German economy during this period has been described as a hybrid system, not quite the free market capitalism of the West, nor the total state control of the Soviet Union. Major industries remained privately owned, but they operated under strict government direction. Companies like Krupp, IG Farben, and others profited enormously from government contracts while collaborating closely with the regime. Here's something that surprises many people. Germany didn't immediately shift to total war production when the war started. In fact, for the first few years of the war, civilian production continued at relatively high levels. The Nazi leadership believed the war would be short and victorious, so they didn't want to impose too many hardships on the German population. This changed in 1943. After devastating defeats at Stalingrad and in North Africa, it became clear that Germany was in a fight for survival. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, who had been appointed Minister of Armaments, oversaw a dramatic transformation to total war economy. The results were actually remarkable. Despite increasing Allied bombing campaigns and the loss of occupied territories, German production of tanks and aircraft increased by 2 to 3 times between 1943 and 1944. Fighter plane production went from about 1,000 per month in early 1943 to over 3,000 per month by mid-1944. How was this possible? Several factors contributed. First, German industry had significant unused capacity in the early war years. When they finally committed fully to war production, there was room for dramatic increases. Second, rationalization and efficiency improvements made a difference. Speer standardized production processes, reduced the variety of models being produced, and focused on designs that could be manufactured more quickly. Third, the increased use of slave labor, as we mentioned earlier, provided a massive workforce that could be exploited without regard for humane conditions or labor costs. Fourth, Germany dispersed production to underground facilities and smaller workshops to protect against bombing. While Allied bombing did disrupt production, it wasn't as devastating as sometimes believed. But here's the crucial point. Even with these impressive production increases, Germany couldn't match Allied output. The United States alone was producing more tanks, planes, and ships than Germany could dream of. The Soviet Union was churning out equipment at an incredible rate. Britain maintained substantial production despite being bombed themselves. Germany was essentially trying to outproduce the combined industrial might of the United States, Soviet Union, and British Empire. It was a losing proposition from the start. By late 1944, the German economy was completely devoted to military production. Civilian services had largely shut down. Entertainment venues closed. All resources went to the war effort. But the situation was becoming desperate. Allied bombing, while not as effective as hoped in stopping production, was devastating Germany's infrastructure. Railways were destroyed, making it difficult to move raw materials and finished goods. Oil refineries were particular targets, and fuel shortages became critical. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was grounding planes not because they didn't have aircraft, but because they didn't have fuel. The loss of occupied territories meant the loss of resources and labor. As the Soviet Union pushed westward and the Western Allies moved through France, Germany lost access to Ukrainian grain, Romanian oil, and French industrial production. The synthetic fuel and rubber programs that were supposed to make Germany self-sufficient proved inadequate under the strain of total war. By early 1945, the German economy was in freefall. Production plummeted not because of lack of will, but because the fundamental inputs weren't available. Factories stood idle for lack of raw materials. Workers couldn't get to their jobs because transportation had broken down. The final months of the war saw the complete collapse of economic activity. The currency became worthless. In some areas, the economy reverted to barter. Food shortages became severe, even for soldiers at the front. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the economy was essentially non-functioning. Infrastructure was devastated, cities were in ruins, and the population was on the brink of starvation. So what can we learn from this economic history? First, the German economic miracle of the 1930s was built on unsustainable foundations. Massive deficit spending, coerced labor, and preparation for conquest created an illusion of prosperity that required continuous expansion to maintain. Second, the exploitation of occupied territories reveals the fundamentally predatory nature of the Nazi system. This wasn't just about military conquest, it was about economic extraction on a massive scale. Third, the use of slave labor represents one of the great moral crimes of the 20th century. Millions of people were worked to death to fuel the German war machine. Companies that profited from this labor faced reckonings after the war, though many would argue not enough. Fourth, even impressive industrial achievement couldn't overcome fundamental resource disparities. Germany's production increases in 1943-44 were remarkable, but they couldn't match the combined output of their enemies. Fifth, the German economy shows us that economic factors can't be separated from military and political history. Germany's defeat wasn't just military, it was economic. They simply couldn't sustain the war effort against multiple powerful enemies with larger economies and more resources. Finally, the collapse of the German economy in 1945 set the stage for the post-war division of Germany and the larger Cold War. The economic devastation required massive reconstruction efforts, leading to the Marshall Plan in the West and Soviet economic control in the East. The economic history of Nazi Germany during World War II is a story of rapid militarization, brutal exploitation, impressive industrial achievement, and ultimate collapse. It reminds us that wars are won not just on battlefields, but in factories, mines, and fields. Economic capacity matters, and no amount of military skill can overcome fundamental resource disadvantages in a prolonged conflict. If you found this video informative, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more historical deep dives. Let me know in the comments what aspect of World War II economics you'd like me to explore next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.